So we're just going to give it another minute before we get going, just to allow for a few more people to arrive. Hope everybody's safe and well today. Okay, well, welcome and good afternoon, brothers, sisters, comrades, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today for this call on Workers' Memorial Day. My name is Shelley Asquith. I work for the TUC and I'll be introducing the speakers for today's meeting. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who you are, where you're from, where you work, which union you're a member of. It's of course always with a heavy heart that we come together on the 28th of April for Workers' Memorial Day every year. It's a day that is commemorated the world over. And as we meet now, thousands of others across the globe are meeting to remember workers who have died in large-scale tragedies or in single instances, from asbestos to COVID or fatal injury. More people die at work than in wars, and we remember all of them, be they from Britain or beyond, union member or non-union member. They have one thing in common: their deaths were preventable. And so we organise in their memory because we know that workplaces with unions are safer. They have fewer instances of work-related injury, illness and death. A unionised workplace is a safer one. And that is why our mantra, remember the dead, fight for the living, is a call to action. To every worker to get unionised, to every union member to get organised, and to every safety rep, we've got your back. I'm so delighted to be joined this afternoon by esteemed colleagues from the Labour and Trade Union movement. And I'd like to begin by asking our first speaker to address the meeting. A real friend to trade unions in Parliament, he has held this government to account repeatedly this year over COVID safety failings. He continues to champion workers' rights and trade union freedom as Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights, Andy McDonald MP. We just need to make sure you're unmuted, Andy.
How if I do that, does that help us a little bit?
Can hear you loud and clear. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks. And thanks for the invite to join you. And you're right, we come together on this most important of days every year to remember the dead and fight for the living. But this year, we do so to mark the deaths of an unprecedented number of working people. The pandemic has left the UK with one of the highest death rates in the world and the most severe economic crisis of any major economy. And the neglect of workplace safety and protecting workers is central to this failure. And whilst these deficits have their roots in pre-COVID times, at every stage of the pandemic, the government failed to take workplace safety seriously enough. This was clear at the start of the pandemic when COVID secure guidance was issued. The guidance failed to even reference existing legislation which regulates and restricts the risks to which workers are exposed, including on providing PPE, cleaning and washing, risk assessments, and protections for those workers raising concerns. And rather than clearly stating that these are statutory duties enforceable in the last resort by criminal sanctions, the guidance spoke of social distancing and hand washing as merely matters of good practice. In failing to make clear existing rights and duties for employees and employers, the guidance misled some employers into breaching their legal obligations on workplace safety. It's outrageous that the guidance was so lacking, but the real scandal has been the lack of enforcement action. And the Health and Safety Executive in particular has been found wanting, despite the tireless and dedicated work of its staff. And following 23,000 separate complaints on workplace safety, the HSE issued only 41 notices. This is just 0.18% of cases. and only 2 of these notices were prohibition notices. And over the same period, more than 70,000 members of the public were fined for breaking lockdown rules. The government brought in new powers for the police to restrain citizens from putting others at risk in the public sphere, while at the same time, it neglected the enforcement of workplace protections and enabled some employers to flout the law in workplaces and put at risk the health and safety of workers and in turn the wider public. The inability of the HSE to protect workers is partly due to years of budget cuts, with its funding halved since 2010 and the number of inspectors cut by 1/3, though the most significant reason for these failures are as a result of the decisions taken by the HSE. And Shelley, you referred to the work we do in Parliament. In response to a question in Parliament, I found that the HSE chose to classify COVID as a significant but not a serious workplace risk. And the justification was that the effects are non-permanent or reversible, non-progressive, and that disability is temporary. And that just ignores the effect of long COVID, not to mention the thousands of workers who have tragically died. The consequence of this classification is that inspectors didn't have the power to take enforcement action, explaining the lack of action to protect workers. It's little wonder that UK workers have suffered so greatly, given that the organisation trusted with protecting them did not classify COVID as serious. And another shocking example is the HSE guidance on RIDDOR, reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrences. Employers ought to register occupational cases and deaths, but the HSE advised them against making reports for workers in public-facing roles because they claimed that contact with the public is not sufficient evidence. And we know that public-facing occupations are among the hardest hit by the coronavirus. But the guidance from the HSE effectively allows employers to ignore these cases and deaths. This has facilitated the mass underreporting of workplace cases and deaths. The HSE and government chose to ignore the impact of the virus on the workers, which put employers at risk of breaching their legal obligations. And this not only undermines the accuracy of mapping of occupational infections and deaths, it undermines any future public inquiry into the pandemic. And the pandemic's exposed the extent to which workers are expected to put themselves at risk, and it's shown which groups of workers perform the work that's most vital to us as a society, the key workers. And it's also exposed the long-standing inequalities in our society. Black and Asian and minority ethnic people have died at a disproportionate rate. They've been more likely to be in frontline sectors or have also been overexposed to the virus and more likely to suffer the economic consequences. Wider socioeconomic inequalities were also exposed, with working class occupations experiencing a disproportionate impact. And many people have said that after this pandemic is over, there can't be a return to business as usual. I agree, but unfortunately, there's no sign that the government intends to strengthen workers' rights and protections. If anything, the opposite is true. The weakness of employment rights and protections in the UK, combined with rising unemployment, is encouraging low-paid, insecure and dangerous work. And we see this as the gig economy continues to grow, with companies such as Amazon becoming an even larger part of our economy, causing a growth in bogus self-employment and unsafe working conditions. And we can also see how key workers paid for the mishandling of the crisis with their lives, and now others are paying with their livelihoods as practices such as fire and rehire become widespread. The fundamental weakness of employment rights and protections speaks to the imbalance of power in the workplace that has become so evident. This Workers' Memorial Day, we are remembering all those who fell in or died as a result of their work, particularly those workers on whom we all relied throughout the pandemic. but it also feels more important than ever before to fight for a new deal for working people, where all workers are safe, where all work is rewarded with fair pay and security, and to rebalance power in the workplace for the benefit and protection of working people. We remember the dead and fight for the living.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you for emphasising there the importance of effective regulation and enforcement of safety at work and how wanting, as you said, that's been over the last year. Thanks for your work in raising the issue to government and, of course, to the Health and Safety Executive. And as you say, COVID is a serious workplace health and safety risk, and it should be recognised as such. Next, I'd like to invite a representative of the Families Against Corporate Killers campaign, a collective who have lost loved ones to health and safety failures in the workplace. In memory of her brother Michael, who lost his life aged 26 in an electrical incident at work, Louise has been an inspiring advocate for justice, and it is always so powerful to hear you speak. Thank you so much for being here today, Louise Adamson.
Thanks, Shelley. Well, I don't think any of us would need convincing that it's fundamentally wrong that a wife should need to write heartbreakingly about her 6th year on the grief roller coaster, missing her beautiful angel husband so much with every passing hour of her life. That it's fundamentally wrong that a mum should be marking the 18th year since her 17-year-old son was taken from her. The pain that she feels never healing, instead festering like an open wound. That it's fundamentally wrong that a daughter should wish her dad a happy 56th birthday while lamenting the fact that he will be forever 37. And it's fundamentally wrong that a fiancé should go from choosing wedding cars to instead sitting in a funeral cortege. We FACKers were therefore at a loss to understand why we're even having to seek to convince the International Labour Organization that health and safety should be recognised as a fundamental right at work, because of course it should. So seek to do so we will, and that will involve us taking you on our FACking journey, a FACKer's experience of a work-related, life-ending journey. Just when does such a journey begin? Is it when a loved one leaves home to go to work with the intention of making a better and a fuller life for themselves, for their families, for us? That's how it feels for Katrina. She said, "A year ago today, my life ended at 7:25 a.m. The last time I saw my everything, my Mr. Hendry alive, as he walked out our kitchen door and does it begin when we get the harrowing call to say our loved one has been in an accident, when the police appear at our door in scenes we thought we'd only ever see on TV, when we ourselves set off for the hospital not knowing what condition we're going to find our loved one in when we get there, or when the organ donor nurse calls us to tell us that they are finally at peace, when we're escorted from the cold place where they lay, or when our stricken loved one is finally retrieved from the place where their life ebbed away. The ending of our loved one's life begins our own lifelong journey, and it is all so fundamentally wrong. Because by the time we all go to bed tonight, this will have been the day that at least another 140 families here in the UK set off on this fateful journey, caused by death due to a work-related incident or caused by a work-related illness. Same again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, and so on, unless significant enough change is brought about. So have we been looking at this all wrong? Because does our journey in fact begin when our loved one's employer decides that the health and safety of its workforce just simply isn't an important enough priority? Does it begin when decisions are taken, or indeed are not taken, and as a result, our partner or parent, sibling or child, friend or family member is then exposed to the hazardous substances, processes, or work environment which results in their death? Are we in fact on this journey because government decided that hard-won legislative protections should be stripped back, and that calls for legislative improvement, they should be knocked back. Do we travel this road because our enforcement authorities have had their abilities to carry out proactive preventative inspections stifled, because their governance and their resources have been rifled? And do we have our progress heartbreakingly hampered by the inability of our justice system to deliver answers quickly enough and thoroughly enough? Indeed, often to even provide something approaching what would pass for justice at all. Because justice, it would mean that organisations and individuals would be held properly to account, charged with offences that fit the crime. It would mean punishment which serves as a deterrent to others. And it would mean ensuring that lessons are learned swiftly enough so that future deaths are prevented. So that when a young man calls his mum to tell her, "I'm drowning in dreams, mother dear," that he actually gets to live to see out those dreams with his partner, rather than them both lose their lives the very next day when a fire, an entirely preventable fire, ravages the hotel in which they are staying. His dear mother is still fighting for answers and for justice for her boys more than 3 years on. All of this is so very fundamentally wrong. The mum of Tom, who lost his life when he was only 21 years old, she wrote recently, "Every day I cry for you and what you lost. I have a painful yearning and ache in my chest, constantly, to see you, to hug you, to hear you, to talk to you. And there is nothing I can do about it." The ILO has it within their power to do something about this by recognising that our loved ones should have had a fundamental right to be kept safe and to return to us at least as healthy as they were when they left home. We FACKers will continue with you in whatever ways we can to seek to make right the current fundamental on this FACking journey, one which proved life-ending for our loved ones and will be lifelong for us. We FACKers, we remember all of the dead, and we commit to continuing to fight like hell for the living.
Thank you so much, Louise. That statement by the campaign is incredibly powerful, and it hits hard the huge loss felt by people and how far we've still got to go to deliver justice and prevent future deaths at work. Force bosses to take seriously the health and safety of workers. We remember every worker today, but we also remember every family affected by that death and stand in solidarity with you all. I'd like to invite everybody watching to visit the TUC online memorial wall that we've created this year, to either pay a tribute to somebody or just to read and share the stories of those workers. It's very moving. Our next speaker is again someone who is a firm supporter of trade unions and workers' rights in Parliament. She has been vocal on the issue of regulation in the construction industry to protect health and safety following a tragic crane collapse in her constituency of Poplar and Limehouse last year. And she's spoken up repeatedly on the disproportionate effect of COVID on BAME workers. Thank you so much for joining us today, Apsana Begum MP.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you so much to the TUC for having me speak on such an important day as well. I want to start by referring to what you've actually just said, to the tragedy in my constituency in East London last summer, when a construction crane collapsed and heartbreakingly took the life of one of my constituents, June Harvey. I often find myself asking the question, how can it still be true that there continue to be a number of incidents and accidents involving cranes? Unfortunately, it's clear to me that this latest incident is set in the context of campaigners and trade unions raising concerns about the under-regulation of health and safety in the construction industry and the drop in inspections as a result of cuts to the health and safety executive. Obviously, there is extra poignancy to this year's International Workers' Memorial Day due to the pandemic. And today we honor all of those who've lost their lives simply as a result of the job that they do. It's particularly important, I feel, to reflect on and acknowledge the enormous contribution that NHS and social care workers, along with other key workers, have made during the pandemic, despite the failures at all levels that have contributed to thousands of staff dying across all sections of the various workforces. And when we talk about key workers, it's not only those that I've just mentioned that keep society going, it's the transport workers, it's the postal workers, supermarket shelf stackers, delivery drivers, taxi drivers, cleaners, and so many more. For most of us, the pandemic has illuminated the far-reaching inequalities that continue to blight our society. And I think it's unacceptable that we are still having to campaign that the health and well-being of workers is actually protected. In particular, I'd say, right from the beginning of the pandemic, it was really clear that Black, Asian, and ethnic minority workers were facing enhanced risks as they often worked in insecure jobs in particular sectors with fewer rights at work and less safe conditions. In other words, the jobs ethnic minority people tend to do are a major reason that they are at greater risk of illness and death, something that is well documented and has been well documented throughout the pandemic and even before the pandemic. Discrimination and racism, again, is shown to be the question of really life and death. We've been speaking about issues like this over and over again. The government have been warned and advised, and to be honest, even begged to do the right thing. And nevertheless, I mean, people are still being forced to work in these unsafe conditions. And shockingly, a study by the Royal College of Nurses even revealed that at one point, nursing staff of ethnic minority backgrounds experienced the greatest PPE shortages. So not only has there been a failure to step up and recognize that all lives matter, and that this must really mean that Black lives matter, the government has had the audacity and the gall to insult us with their denial of institutional racism. And yet, as I speak, we know that thousands of workers feel pressured to return to jobs even when they are still at risk of spreading COVID-19 in those workplaces. Workers have been let down by this government. They've been let down by this government and the government's refusal to properly engage with trade unions over and over and over again, resulting in this astonishing litany of failures, including but definitely not limited to the inconsistent and unclear regulations, the failure to ensure that all workers have access to PPE, the failure to protect workers from unsafe working conditions, and the failure to properly support workers to prevent them from being pressured into difficult situations or being forced to decide between economic welfare on one hand or their health on the other, given the inadequacy of sick pay, and so much more. And meanwhile, while all of this is going on, the culture of outsourcing and casualization of contracts has made it harder, even harder, to protect workers as well. And this is why, as restrictions are eased, it's completely correct, in my view, that trade unions have been warning that the vaccine rollout and workplace testing must not be used as an excuse to relax safe working rules. And I think that's really, really vital going forward. I'll continue to stand alongside the labour movement in solidarity and do everything I can to drive these messages forward and to hold the government to account in Parliament. To put it simply, I think it's not only that there have been so many avoidable and preventable deaths, but that so many have been premature deaths, and any one premature death is one too many. We need justice for all those who've lost their lives when it could have been otherwise prevented. Because whilst it's true that the pandemic would always have been a challenge to society, the UK government's approach has been utterly reckless, utterly callous, and all too often it's workers who've paid the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Apsana, especially for putting a spotlight there on the inequalities aspect of this. BAME workers and also migrant workers more likely to be in those insecure and non-unionised workplaces. And as a result at higher risk of illness, injury, and death from work. And that is why our movement's approach to workers' rights is an anti-racist one. Our next speaker is a reminder that today is an international day being observed all around the world. She is the leading representative of the global trade union movement, the International Trade Union Confederation, which collectively represents 207 million trade union members in 163 countries around the world. The ITUC has this year called for today's Workers' Memorial Day theme to be health and safety at work is a fundamental right, as they call on the ILO to make it one of its key priorities. It's a real honour to be joined by ITUC General Secretary Sharan Burrow.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. And I'm struck by, you know, the real personal pain as well as the advocacy of other panelists. And I know Frances will follow me, and indeed she's one of the greatest advocates for working people in your country that anybody could ever wish for. But indeed, we have called for the ILO to make this a fundamental right. You simply can't look at the statistics or hear of the stories of preventable death and not demand that this is the case. So when we look at the situation today, it is indeed tragic that in the face of just over a year of a pandemic, we see still 136 million healthcare workers, care workers generally, their lives are at risk every day with inadequate safety equipment or PPE. But we also know that worldwide, one health worker dies from COVID exposure every 30 minutes, and this is definitely preventable. If you indeed go beyond what is obvious in the face of the pandemic, even before COVID-19, every day 410 construction workers are killed at work. Every week 5,000 people die from lung disease or cancer due to asbestos. Every minute 730 people are poisoned by pesticides, and the lack of regulation of pesticides is a global scandal. And every day 7,600 workers die of work accidents or disease. These are preventable. If governments won't take responsibility to hold employers to account, if the conditions at work are not there, then we know that saving lives at work is indeed not being taken seriously. There are more deaths at work than at war, as Shelley said. And indeed, if you reframe these deaths, if there was a terror attack that actually took that many lives, the world would be outraged. And yet we see more outrage, as sad as it is, for road-related deaths than we do see for deaths that are preventable at work. We need change, and it must be that the ILO absolutely recognises this as a fundamental right. We saw the door open with the decision in March of the ILO's governing body. We want to make sure that all our unions continue to lobby their governments so that there's no question that this will be on the agenda at the 2022 ILO conference. But we must go further than that. In the current context, COVID-19 must be recognised as an occupational disease. And even where it is, too many of those countries don't recognise all workers, all workplaces. And despite the fact that they are indeed the sites of the greatest spreading of the disease, including schools, but also compensation is too often indeed missing. I know that the TUC fought very hard to get COVID-related or pandemic sick leave guaranteed, continuing to be guaranteed. We need to make sure that workers are supported. And saving lives at work in a pandemic is more than about just preventing the disease or the deaths of those workers. It's actually also about running safe workplaces that in and itself reduces the transmission of the disease in the broader community. So that's why we've demanded as a global movement that the TRIPS waiver should indeed, or the intellectual property rights to vaccines should be shared. But more than that, manufacturing solidarity should actually be shared so that you have the capacity with the properly managed supply chains to have the elements of the vaccine manufactured in countries with indeed the oversight to see that the safety and the proper health-related frameworks for that is possible. This is about global solidarity. It is about saving lives. Vaccine nationalism is ugly, but so too is workplace disease and death. Today, we indeed remember the dead, we mourn their passing, but we are reaffirming our commitment to fight for the living. Saving lives at work means we must have occupational health and safety as a fundamental right. Thank you all for your solidarity.
Thank you so much, Sharan. Some incredibly shocking statistics at the beginning there. One health worker every 30 minutes dying of COVID. More than 400 construction workers killed at work every day. Still one of the most dangerous jobs. We as a TUC absolutely support your call on the ILO. Occupational health and safety must be considered a fundamental right, and we'll be lobbying our own government as well. Our next and final speaker is our very own representative of the trade union movement in Britain. 5.5 million working people as members of their trade union make up the TUC. Closing the event today is our General Secretary, Frances O'Grady.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Thanks to everybody on the panel, brilliant contributions, and thanks to everybody for logging on. I do want to send solidarity to all workers and reps fighting for safety, health, and mental well-being too at work. But I do just want to give a shout out to PCS members at DVLA, because I think in many ways their struggle represents all our struggles. It is about health and safety, but it is also about dignity and respect, and working people having a voice, and what's more, being listened to. And it seems to me they've been denied that dignity for far too long. And I know that everybody on this call will stand shoulder to shoulder with them in their next round of industrial action. It is an international day, and it's so great to hear from Sharan, our fantastic leader of the ITUC. And I think, again, I speak for all of us, Sharan, when I say that you can count on us. We know that this is an international cause, particularly in respect of the pandemic, that has to be about vaccines and ventilators for all. It has to be beyond borders, and it has to be people being put before profit. No one is safe until we're all safe. Now we need to make that mean something. Of course, this day is about all the hazards that are faced at work, but it is obviously dominated by the pandemic and who has borne the brunt. And as we've already heard from Apsana and others, you know, too often it's key workers in the front line, Black and ethnic minority workers, as the TUC analysis has showed very clearly, covered in the media, much more likely to be on insecure contracts, much less likely to have proper PPE. And not forgetting the millions who still cannot even exercise a right to basic statutory sick pay because they earn too little to qualify. It is high time that we fixed this sick pay problem. People must not be faced with that impossible choice of doing the right thing by public health and taking time off for sick or to self-isolate, and being able to put shoes on your children's feet. It is wrong, and it has to change. In the midst of all of this crisis and pandemic, you know, when we have so many exhausted key workers feeling so let down with those pathetic pay caps and pay freezes, I think it is even more shocking, and I think we have to acknowledge today, sadly, it is even more shocking that we apparently have a government up to its neck in allegations of sleaze. You know, when you're telling health workers that you can't afford more than 1%, when you're telling other public sector workers they're getting nothing, and by the way, this is a real pay cut. In real terms, this is a pay cut. And then at the same time, we hear about mates of the government getting contracts, or worse still, in my view, the shocking allegation of language that the Prime Minister would rather let bodies pile high than see a further lockdown. I think enough is enough, because when people talk about bodies, let us remind them that is a person you're talking about, a person with a name, a person with a family, a person who is missed by their loved ones and whose loved ones are grieving. Again, show some respect. And that's one of the reasons why the TUC has today called for a full and proper independent public inquiry into the government's handling of this pandemic. The government says no, they're too busy, apparently. Well, we're not going to accept no for an answer. And if not now, then when? Tell us when we can have that public inquiry, because I tell you, key workers and all workers deserve some answers. We need to know why it was the government was so ill prepared for this pandemic. And I think many of us have some answers on that. 10 years of austerity and cutting corners and lack of preparation did not help. We know that there is a clear link between outbreaks in workplaces and extreme exploitation. Just ask those working in the sweatshops in Leicester in fast fashion and ask what contracts pay they were on, what voice they had, and how impossible it was for them to take time off the job. So, and we've learned, haven't we, that one outbreak in one factory can shut down a whole city. We do need to know, and Andy, absolute credit to Andy for pursuing this. We need to know why the HSE categorised the pandemic as only significant, not serious, with real consequences for the resources that were put in, the inspections that were put in or not. And we need to know why not a single employer has been prosecuted during the course of this pandemic. I want to just end with this. I want to end by paying tribute to all our amazing health and safety reps and campaigners, including those who have faced victimization for standing up for what should be a basic human right, the right to be safe and healthy at work. And I want to say this, that UK and worldwide, we will stick together, we will stay strong, we will stand in solidarity, we will remember the dead, but my goodness me, we will fight for the living. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances, for reminding everyone what the TUC is fighting for in the face of those failings by this government, but also how important being in a union is and the incredible contribution of our union safety reps, more than 100,000 of them across the country. And please, if you're a union member watching and you're not a safety rep, please consider becoming one. The TUC will offer you all the training you need, as will your union, and we will support you in everything you do to make your workplace safer. It's a life-saving job. Please do consider it. This event has been recorded today. It will be available on YouTube this evening. You can also find many more events being hosted by trades councils around the country on our website, Zoom calls, online meetings, as well as many more resources and information that we've produced for Workers' Memorial Day. It's tuc.org.uk. We have an online memorial page where you can read or submit tributes to workers who've lost their lives. We've got a timeline about the history of safety at work in Britain. And as I say, find many more events taking place this evening. Thank you so much to all our speakers who've joined us this afternoon. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. Stay safe and solidarity.